sorry!
Everything stopped when the Mafia boss exploded over a steak. The waiters trembled, hiding in fear. But Amelia, she didn't back down. She walked straight up to him, looked him in the eye, and said the one thing no one ever dared: "You don't own me."
Get out! Please, no, I'm sorry!
Hey, if you're loving this story, a quick like or subscribe goes a long way in helping me keep creating. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every message, and it always makes my day. The golden chandeliers above Valentino's restaurant cast a soft, ethereal glow, illuminating the polished silverware and crisp white tablecloths that graced each carefully arranged table. The atmosphere was one of quiet elegance, where each breath seemed measured and every word carefully chosen. It was the kind of place where the rich and powerful came to dine, where conversations were held in hushed tones, and where no one dared to disturb the peace for fear of angering the wrong person. Every corner of the restaurant radiated exclusivity. The guests were no strangers to power. Politicians, moguls, and those who thrived in the shadows of the city's underworld. The waitstaff, though accustomed to the affluence around them, had learned long ago to tread lightly, to serve, to smile, and to disappear into the background. Their jobs required perfection, no mistakes, no interruptions, just flawless execution. And then there was him, the man who sat in the corner booth every Tuesday night, like clockwork, the same way he had for months. His name, Lorenzo Moretti, was whispered with reverence and fear in the back corridors of Valentino's, as it was across the entire city. A cold and calculating mafia boss, known to all as the Wolf. Lorenzo commanded respect and loyalty not through charm or charisma, but through fear. And that fear was palpable every time he walked into the room. At 42, Lorenzo had the kind of presence that made people's spines stiffen before they even saw him. He was impeccably dressed in a black suit that seemed custom-made for his tall, imposing frame. His hair, dark and slicked back, framed a face that was hard, unmoving, eyes that could freeze a man's blood with a single glance. A faint scar ran across his jaw, a reminder of a past filled with violence, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. Lorenzo didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to keep the room on edge. And when he spoke, people listened, or else. As always, he sat with his back to the wall, a position that allowed him to survey the entire restaurant, ensuring nothing escaped his notice. It was the perfect seat for a man who ruled half the city's underground operations. His mind was always calculating, always several steps ahead. Tonight was no different. The head waiter, Antonio, approached him with the practiced deference that had become second nature. His hands trembled slightly, a subtle but unmistakable sign of the fear he harbored for the man who occupied the corner booth. "Mr. Moretti, your usual?" Antonio asked, his voice quiet, respectful. Lorenzo didn't look up from his phone, his jaw tightening slightly as he read the text from his consigliere about a shipment issue at the docks. His eyes narrowed as he processed the information, and he cut into the steak on his plate with more force than necessary. Someone was skimming from him, a fool who thought he could steal from Lorenzo Moretti and get away with it. He would deal with them just as he dealt with everything else, permanently. "You know what I want, Antonio," Lorenzo muttered, still not looking up. "Right away." The waiter nodded quickly, relief evident in his posture as he retreated. As Antonio hurried to the kitchen, the room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone in the restaurant was acutely aware of Lorenzo's presence. They'd all heard the stories. The families who crossed the Morettis vanished. Their businesses burned to the ground, but it was all whispers, unproven rumors. Still, no one dared challenge him, no one but her. Amelia Reyes had worked at Valentino's for the past 5 years, earning her place among the staff who catered to the city's elite. She wasn't like the others, she was different. For one, Amelia wasn't intimidated by the guests, no matter their wealth or power. Her life wasn't shaped by the people she served, but by the people she loved. Her brother, Miguel, was sick, very sick, and his mounting medical bills were the only thing that drove her to work double shifts in the high-end restaurant. At 28, Amelia had seen enough of life's cruelty to last a lifetime. From her early days in the restaurant, she'd learned how to blend into the background, becoming invisible to the guests who treated her like little more than a servant. And for the most part, she'd accepted it. But tonight, something inside her snapped. Amelia had just placed a tray of champagne glasses on table 7 when she heard the raised voice coming from the corner. It was impossible not to. Lorenzo's voice, though soft, carried across the suddenly silent room. "This is unacceptable," he said, his tone icy. She turned toward the sound, her gaze falling on him, Lorenzo Moretti, sitting at his usual booth, glaring down at his plate. He pushed it away with disgust. "I asked for the meat medium rare," he continued, his voice cold and sharp. "This is practically raw." Antonio rushed over, pale and apologetic, his hands trembling. "Mr. Moretti, I apologize profusely. I'll have Chef Michel prepare a new dish immediately." Lorenzo didn't care for Antonio's apology. He was used to people begging for his forgiveness, used to being obeyed without question. But this wasn't about the food. It never was. This was about power, and everyone in the restaurant knew it. Amelia felt her jaw tighten as she watched the scene unfold. She had seen the plate when Antonio brought it out. The meat was cooked perfectly, just the right amount of pink in the center, just as it should be. Amelia had worked at Valentino's long enough to know good food when she saw it. And this was a mistake, yes, but it wasn't one that required a tantrum. The thing that caught her attention, though, was not the food. It was the way everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, the way the piano player had stopped playing, his hands hovering over the keys, the way the waiters froze mid-step, watching the scene unfold with a mix of fear and reverence. They were all waiting for the explosion, for the inevitable eruption that would come from defying Lorenzo. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. The fear, the silence, the tension in the air, it was all too much. She knew the rules. She knew the power dynamic, but tonight she couldn't remain silent. She couldn't let this man continue to bully her coworkers, especially when he was wrong. Without thinking, she walked toward the corner booth. Her red apron stood out against the muted decor of the restaurant, but it wasn't the apron that drew attention. It was her, the girl who dared to challenge the wolf. "Is there a problem, sir?" Amelia asked, her voice calm but firm. She met his gaze without hesitation, a directness that caught Lorenzo off guard. Most people, even those who worked for him, would have lowered their eyes by now, but not Amelia. Lorenzo looked up, his eyes narrowing, his expression darkening. He stood slowly, his towering frame making him seem even more imposing. His lips curled into a sneer as he loomed over her. "The problem," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is that I'm paying for quality and receiving garbage." Amelia didn't flinch. She had faced worse in her life, and for the first time she realized she wasn't afraid of him. "The meat is cooked exactly as you ordered it," she replied, her voice steady. "I saw it myself before Antonio brought it out." The room fell into an even deeper silence. People stared, waiting for the explosion that everyone knew was coming. But it didn't come. Instead, something in Lorenzo shifted. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar. The power he wielded, the fear he instilled in others, had no effect on Amelia. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, without thinking, Amelia spoke the 3 words that would change everything. "You don't own me." The room seemed to hold its breath, frozen in shock. Antonio's eyes went wide, and someone's fork clattered against their plate, the sound sharp and loud in the oppressive quiet. Lorenzo didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he was speechless. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not in the way Amelia had. Not with such calm defiance, not with such conviction. He studied her for a moment as though seeing her for the first time. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated. And in that moment, Lorenzo Moretti, the man who ruled half the city with an iron fist, felt something shift within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity, fascination. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back down, staring at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than control. He felt human. The silence hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity, and as Amelia turned to walk away, she had no idea that this simple act of defiance would change both their lives forever. The air in Valentino's was thick with unease. The usually polished, graceful service had ground to a halt, and the nervous buzz of whispered conversations had fallen into an eerie silence. All eyes were on the corner booth, where Lorenzo Moretti sat, his dark eyes locked on Amelia as she walked away, leaving the room in suspended tension. Amelia's words had hung in the air like a tangible weight, a challenge so blatant, so direct, that it sent a ripple through the restaurant. "You don't own me." It wasn't just the defiance in her voice. It wasn't the way she stood tall in the face of the man who was known to crush anyone who dared to stand against him. It was the look in her eyes, those steady, fearless eyes that had completely unnerved him. He wasn't used to being seen as anything other than a force to be feared. To be questioned, that was something he hadn't experienced in years. The usual responses failed him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't furious, as he had been in the past when someone had dared to defy him. Instead, there was a peculiar silence within him, an odd mix of intrigue and something else he couldn't quite place. Something unfamiliar. For a moment, the restaurant seemed to forget how to breathe. But Lorenzo didn't break his gaze from Amelia. He stayed there, his eyes watching her every move as she retreated toward the kitchen, the soft sway of her red apron, the only thing moving in the stillness. Lorenzo's lips parted for a moment, as though he might say something, but then closed again, his thoughts swirling. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not in this way. There had been challenges in his life, men who had tried to usurp his power, rivals who thought they could push him out of the game. But they always did it with fear or violence, never with the kind of simple, quiet defiance Amelia had just shown him. The sound of the piano resumed. The waiters, though still cautious, began to move again, but the electric tension of the moment lingered, like the hum of an unseen force in the room. The scene had shifted, and Lorenzo Moretti, for the first time in a long while, found himself uncertain. Back in the kitchen, Amelia could still feel the weight of the confrontation, the adrenaline from her defiant stand still coursing through her veins. She had walked away from that booth, but the room, the look in Lorenzo's eyes, and the sheer tension of the moment followed her with every step. As she set the tray of freshly prepared meals onto the counter, her hands shook slightly, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. She was used to dealing with difficult customers, the ones who treated her like she was invisible or expendable. But this had been different. This had been Lorenzo Moretti, the most dangerous man in the city, and she had not only refused to cower before him, but had done so without even the slightest hesitation. Her mind kept replaying those three words, "I'm not scared of you." How had she said that? She had been terrified of the power he wielded, terrified of the stories she'd heard whispered about him. Yet in that moment she hadn't let fear dictate her actions. She'd just spoken the truth. But now the weight of what she'd done began to settle in. Was it foolish? Had she put herself in danger? Everyone in the restaurant had practically frozen in place when she spoke those words. Antonio's terrified face flashed in her mind. She could almost hear the warning in his voice as he'd begged her not to engage with him. She knew the rules, had known them for years. Never challenge the powerful. Never show weakness, never show that you could be intimidated. But had she done something worse? Had she simply poked the wolf too hard? Amelia exhaled a breath, wiping her hands on her apron as she shook her head. It wasn't like her to second-guess herself. especially not when it came to standing up for what was right. She wasn't about to let the fear of what could happen stop her from being the person she wanted to be, the person she needed to be. Her brother depended on her family depended on her, and if she let fear hold her back, if she let herself shrink into the shadows of others' expectations, then what would that say about her? No, she had done what was necessary. If Lorenzo Moretti was as ruthless as they said, he would have retaliated by now. He would have done something, but he hadn't. Instead, he had stayed silent, almost thoughtful. It was that thought that made her pause. Thoughtful. What was that about? That night, when the restaurant had emptied out and the lights had dimmed, Lorenzo Moretti sat alone in his penthouse, the soft hum of the city outside the window failing to mask the restlessness in his mind. He was still thinking about Amelia. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't backed down like every other person who had ever challenged him. They all cowered. They all fell in line eventually. Even the most powerful men were no match for the pressure he applied, for the fear he could instill in their hearts. But Amelia Reyes, she had looked him in the eyes, and for the briefest moment, he saw something in her that unsettled him, a raw courage, an honesty that was foreign to him. She wasn't afraid of him, not even close. The scotch in his glass swirled as he thought back to the moment. "You don't own me." Lorenzo's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. He had never been one to be caught off guard, but this was different. This wasn't just defiance, it was something deeper. She had spoken to him as though he was just another man, not the wolf, not the king of this city, just another man. He placed the glass down on the side table and stood, walking to the window. The city sprawled beneath him, an endless sea of lights and shadows. For years he had built his empire on loyalty, fear, and violence. He had learned that emotions were weaknesses, things that could be used against him. And yet, Amelia, her eyes, her voice, her simple courage, challenged that belief in a way nothing else had. He had ruled his world with cold precision, each move calculated, each gesture designed to maintain control. But what had Amelia shown him? That it was possible to break free from that pattern, to see things differently. And for a brief moment, as she stood before him, her eyes unwavering, he had wondered if there was more to life than power. Power was everything in his world. It was how he had survived, how he had come to rule an empire. But as the years wore on, he had begun to feel something he hadn't expected, the weight of his own isolation, the loneliness that came with building a world where everyone feared him, but no one really saw him, no one truly knew him. Amelia's words echoed in his mind. They were simple, but they cut through the carefully constructed armor he had built around himself. She had spoken the truth in a way that no one else had dared to. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her. The world he had built was one of intimidation, of domination. But Amelia had reminded him of something he thought he had buried long ago: respect, humanity. Lorenzo turned from the window and walked over to the desk, opening the drawer and pulling out a sketchbook. He hadn't drawn in years, not since his youth when he had lost the innocence of those simpler days. But tonight, as his mind lingered on the woman who had defied him, he found himself compelled to draw. He sketched the faint outline of a woman's face, her eyes, her lips, her posture. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop. Her image lingered in his thoughts even after the sketch was done, and as he looked at the finished piece, he couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. Amelia Reyes, the woman who had dared to look the wolf in the eye. He leaned back in his chair, studying the sketch for a long moment before closing the book. His mind was still racing, still wondering what her next move would be. What his next move should be. One thing was certain: the power dynamic between them had shifted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Amelia's defiance had done something Lorenzo hadn't expected. It had planted a seed in his mind, one that was growing, slowly but surely. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, this unsettling desire to know more about her, to understand why she was different. He had never been one to be swayed by emotions, but for the first time in years, he wasn't so sure anymore. Had stretched on like a strange dream for Amelia. She couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over again in her mind. I'm not scared of you. Those words, so simple yet so loaded with meaning, had changed everything. She had stood up to Lorenzo Moretti, and while the world around her still buzzed with fear of his name, she felt no different. She still worked her shifts at the same restaurant, served the same customers, and kept her focus on paying off her brother's mounting medical bills. But in the quiet moments when she would catch herself staring into the distance, the weight of what she had done would settle heavily on her. What had made her do it? What had possessed her to challenge the very man who ruled half of the city's underworld? Amelia had told herself that it was just a job-related confrontation, nothing more. He was just another powerful man who had expected to get his way, and she had refused to let him intimidate her. That was the truth, wasn't it? She had stood up because it was the right thing to do. Yet, despite her best efforts to convince herself otherwise, something gnawed at her. She couldn't help but wonder if the brief, unsettling connection she had shared with Lorenzo was more than a fleeting moment. What had he seen in her? Lorenzo Moretti had never been the type of man to forget anything. His mind was a steel trap, sharp, calculating, and always 2 steps ahead. But something about the woman he had encountered at Valentino's had slipped under his usual defenses. Amelia Reyes was not a woman to be underestimated. For days, Lorenzo found his thoughts drifting back to her, her defiance, her courage, her complete lack of fear when standing in front of him. This was not the behavior he expected from someone who worked in a place like Valentino's. She wasn't like the others who trembled when he walked into a room. Amelia didn't cower. She spoke to him like she was on equal ground, and that, more than anything, had piqued his curiosity. It wasn't just the defiance that drew him in, it was her determination. It was the quiet strength in her eyes that told him she had fought her way through a life of hardship, that she had faced struggles far more dangerous than anything his world had to offer. As the days passed, Lorenzo found himself wondering who she was beneath the surface, beyond the apron and the smile she gave the customers. And so, he began to learn about her. Lorenzo had his ways of finding out things. Within hours of the incident at Valentino's, his people had gathered every scrap of information about her. Amelia Reyes, 28, a nursing student working double shifts to pay for her brother's medical bills. She wasn't the daughter of some wealthy family, nor was she tied to the social elite who frequented the restaurant. No, she was a fighter, someone who worked tirelessly for the ones she loved. Her brother Miguel had been diagnosed with a rare illness that had drained every penny of their savings. Amelia had been taking on extra shifts at Valentino's, doing whatever it took to ensure he received the treatment he needed. It wasn't just the weight of medical bills on her shoulders. It was the responsibility of keeping a promise to protect her family at all costs. For the first time in years, Lorenzo saw a woman who didn't want anything from him. She wasn't looking for favors or protection. She wasn't trying to ingratiate herself with him like most of the women he knew. She had her own battles to fight, and that, in a way, made her stand out even more in his mind. He found himself admiring her, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she could ever see him as something other than the ruthless figure the city feared. Could she see the man behind the reputation? Was there any way for him to be human again, after so many years of building a life based on intimidation and violence? Amelia had no idea that her confrontation with Lorenzo had set off a chain of events in the restaurant that she would soon have to face. The staff at Valentino's had always known to keep their distance from certain guests, those whose names carried more weight than the price of the meal. But after Amelia's direct challenge to Lorenzo, the whispers began. The rumor mill at Valentino's moved fast, and the waitstaff wasn't immune to its power. Some of the waiters, especially the more seasoned ones, were horrified by what had happened. They knew the stakes of upsetting someone like Lorenzo. The unspoken rule of the restaurant was that he was untouchable. His temper, his reputation, his ability to destroy anyone who crossed him. And now Emilia had not only crossed him, but she had done so publicly in front of everyone. "Did you hear what she did?" one waiter whispered to another as they folded napkins in the back room. "Yeah, she confronted him, the Lorenzo Moretti, in front of everyone. She's crazy, doesn't she know who he is?" Emilia, oblivious to the growing tension, continued her shifts as usual. But the looks she received from the other staff members changed. There were whispers when she passed by, sidelong glances filled with both awe and caution. Some of the waiters who had been working at Valentino's for years urged her to be careful. "You don't know who he is, Emilia," they warned her. "You can't challenge someone like him." But Emilia wasn't like the others. She wasn't going to shrink away from the shadows. She wasn't afraid of him. She had made that clear. Yet a part of her couldn't help but wonder, was it arrogance that had led her to stand up to him? Or had she just not realized the gravity of the situation? It was a quiet evening shift when it happened. Emilia had just finished taking an order at a nearby table when she noticed him. Lorenzo Moretti had entered Valentino's once again. As usual, he was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit making him look even more intimidating. But this time, he wasn't sitting in his usual booth. Instead, he stood near the bar as if waiting for something or someone. Before she could process what was happening, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw Antonio, the head waiter, looking at her with a mix of apprehension and confusion. "He's asking for you," Antonio said quietly. "Who?" Emilia asked, not quite understanding. "Lorenzo," he replied, his voice lowered even further. "He wants you to come over." Emilia blinked, her heart skipping a beat. What was this? Was it some sort of joke? Or worse, was he about to lash out at her for her behavior in the restaurant? The thought made her blood run cold, but she nodded and walked toward the bar. As she approached him, Lorenzo stood up from the bar, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pause. He wasn't angry. In fact, he seemed oddly calm, almost polite. "Emilia, right?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I hope I'm not interrupting your shift." Emilia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "No, it's fine," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to speak to you," Lorenzo continued, his gaze unwavering. "I thought perhaps you might join me for a drink after your shift. I'd like to get to know you better." The request was so unexpected that Emilia was momentarily thrown off balance. She knew what he was, who he was, and yet the invitation, delivered without the usual bravado, took her by surprise. She had been expecting confrontation, anger perhaps, maybe even some sort of punishment, but this was something different. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she replied cautiously, trying to maintain her composure. Lorenzo studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he spoke again. "I'm not here to make trouble, just a drink. We can talk about life, no strings attached." Emilia hesitated. The last thing she wanted to do was get involved with someone like him, someone whose world was so far removed from hers. But there was something in his eyes, something almost human beneath the veneer of coldness and power, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt a flicker of curiosity. "All right," she said finally, "I'll have a drink with you, but just one." Lorenzo's smile grew slightly wider. "I'll be waiting." That night, after her shift ended, Emilia found herself walking to the small cafe where Lorenzo had asked to meet her. Her steps were slow, measured. She knew she was about to enter a world she had no business being a part of. But there was something about Lorenzo that made her want to understand him more, something that drew her in despite her better judgment. She was about to find out just how dangerous that curiosity could be. The first meeting had been an anomaly, a fleeting moment where Emilia had dared to step into Lorenzo's world without hesitation. But what had begun as a single, seemingly innocent drink had turned into something far more complicated. Over the course of the next few weeks, their conversations became a pattern. He'd find excuses to linger near the bar after his usual meals at Valentino's, and Amelia would join him after her shifts. At first, she had kept her distance, cautious not to let herself get too drawn into his orbit. But the more they spoke, the harder it became to ignore the undeniable pull between them. Lorenzo wasn't like the men she'd known. He didn't raise his voice, didn't use power to control the conversation. His words were deliberate, measured, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her skin flush. And what was more dangerous was that he didn't try to intimidate her, not the way he did everyone else. Instead, he seemed intrigued by her, curious about what made her tick. There was a vulnerability behind his sharp eyes, a hint of something buried beneath the cold exterior of the Mafia kingpin. It was a vulnerability that he didn't let anyone see, not even her, but Amelia felt it, and that made her want to know more. Lorenzo began to challenge his own worldview, slowly but surely. In his early years of building his empire, love had always been a liability. Love made you weak, vulnerable. It was something to be avoided, something that clouded judgment and put one's power at risk. That's what he had always believed, and that's how he had lived. The people around him, his family, his men, were loyal to him because they feared him, and he had kept it that way, shrouded in intimidation and control. But with Amelia, it was different. He couldn't quite explain it. She was different. She didn't fear him the way everyone else did. It was her strength, her quiet defiance that had drawn him in. It was in the way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she could look him dead in the eye and never once back down, no matter who he was or what he represented. At first, Lorenzo tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that he was treading dangerous waters. She was a waitress, a mere shadow in the grand scheme of his world. But her strength, her refusal to play by the rules that kept others in line, made him question everything. Lorenzo, the man who had built an empire on fear, found himself drawn to her compassion. He saw it in the way she spoke about her brother, the way she cared for those around her. She wasn't just kind, she was selfless. Amelia didn't just work hard for herself. She worked for her family, for something greater than herself. And that, more than anything, intrigued him. Every time they spoke, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't just attraction. There was something deeper, something more dangerous. It was as though the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself were slowly crumbling piece by piece, every time Amelia looked at him like she saw something beyond the Mafia boss. But there was a part of him that resisted. He had spent too long building his reputation to let anyone in. Vulnerability wasn't an option, not in his world. And yet when Amelia spoke to him, when she challenged him, it felt like a breath of fresh air. It felt like something real. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit cafe, Amelia finally asked him the question she'd been avoiding. "Lorenzo, how did you get here?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "How did you end up like this?" It wasn't the first time she'd asked him about his past, but it was the first time she'd done so without any hint of fear. She wasn't afraid of the Mafia boss sitting in front of her. She had stood up to him once already, and despite the danger of her words, she found herself wanting to know more. She wanted to understand him, not the legend, not the rumors, but the man beneath it all. Lorenzo's gaze darkened slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass absent-mindedly. His mind flashed back to the streets he had once roamed as a child, the alleys where survival meant everything. He had been just a boy, orphaned and alone, living among criminals who had raised him as one of their own. The violence, the betrayals, it was all he had ever known. "I didn't choose this life," he said quietly, his voice low as if speaking the words hurt him. "It chose me." Amelia studied his face, trying to see beyond the cold mask he wore so effortlessly. She didn't press further, but his words stayed with her, gnawing at her thoughts. He had risen from nothing, clawing his way to the top of the criminal empire he controlled now. That wasn't just power, it was survival. Her curiosity about him grew, but so did her apprehension. The more she learned, the more she realized that getting closer to him meant risking everything. She had been warned about men like him, men who lived by violence and fear, men who thought they could own the world. But as much as she feared the world he came from, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. It was an attraction she couldn't ignore, even if it threatened to consume her. And as much as she tried to stay away, as much as she wanted to protect herself from the danger his world posed, she found herself growing closer to him with each passing day. She saw the cracks in his armor, the small moments of tenderness he tried to bury. He was a man trapped by his own reputation, by the empire he had built, and the guilt of everything he had done to get there. Tensions in the underworld had always been high, but recently they had reached a boiling point. The Russo family, a rival Mafia faction, had been making moves against Lorenzo's operations, testing the limits of his control. They were pushing boundaries, challenging his authority, and trying to chip away at the empire he had spent years building. Emilia could feel the shift in the air, even in her own life. The days following their conversations grew heavier with an unspoken tension. Lorenzo had stopped coming to Valentino's as often, but his presence was felt everywhere. Rumors of the Russo family's encroachment on his territory had spread like wildfire, and the tension was palpable. One night, as Emilia worked a late shift, she noticed the unease in the restaurant. The staff was whispering among themselves, eyes darting nervously to the corner booth where Lorenzo used to sit. But tonight, he wasn't there. Instead, a few of his men had shown up, their faces grim and serious, their presence a stark reminder that trouble was on the horizon. Emilia had never seen Lorenzo's world so close, but now it was impossible to ignore. She could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, could sense the danger that had been lurking beneath the surface of their conversations. She had been warned, told time and time again that being involved with a man like Lorenzo was too dangerous. And now she saw the reality of it. The next evening, as she finished her shift, Emilia received a message from Lorenzo. He wanted to meet her. She had barely processed the message before she felt the familiar weight of unease settle in her chest. She had known this was coming, but she hadn't expected the consequences to hit so quickly. When she arrived at the cafe, Lorenzo was already there, sitting at their usual corner table. His face was serious, a look she hadn't seen before. The usual light in his eyes was gone, replaced by something darker, something that hinted at the storm he had been trying to weather. "I need to talk to you, Ma," he said, his voice low. Emilia sat down across from him, her heart racing. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. "The Russo family is making a play for my territory," he said, his eyes hardening. "They're pushing us into a corner. I have to deal with them, and it's going to get ugly." Emilia felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew this was the moment where everything would change. She had known the risks of being involved with Lorenzo, but now those risks were staring her in the face. He was at war, and she was caught in the middle. "Do you ever want out of this life?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lorenzo's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "I didn't have a choice. You think I chose this? It's all I know." Emilia reached across the table, her hand finding his. "But you have a choice now," she said quietly. "You can choose to walk away. You can choose something better, something safer." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence between them, as though he were weighing her words against everything he had ever known. "I don't know if I can," he said softly, "but I know that if I lose you, it won't matter anyway." The conversation ended with no clear answers. Emilia left the cafe with a heavy heart, her mind racing. Lorenzo's world was collapsing around him, and she was right in the middle of it. She had to make a choice, keep her distance or risk it all. But one thing was certain, Lorenzo Moretti was no longer just the dangerous Mafia boss she had confronted in Valentino's. He was a man who had begun to question everything he had ever believed, and that, in itself, made him more dangerous than ever. Emilia had always known that there were risks in getting too close to someone like Lorenzo Moretti. She had heard the whispers, seen the stories in the newspapers, felt the tension whenever his name was mentioned. He wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of power, of danger. And now, as she stood at the edge of a world she had never wanted to be a part of, she could no longer ignore the price of her choices. The night had started like any other, a late shift at Valentino's, the usual ebb and flow of elegant guests who had no idea that the world they operated in was far more precarious than they realized. Lorenzo had been distant lately, his usual visits becoming less frequent. The war with the Russo family was escalating, and it seemed as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But Emilia had kept working, kept pushing through her exhaustion, focusing on the future, on the nursing school exams she couldn't afford to fail. But then came the phone call. It had been an ordinary evening, the restaurant emptying out after the dinner rush, when the sharp ring of her phone had shattered the silence. She glanced at the screen, a number she didn't recognize. Hesitating for only a moment, she answered, "Emilia." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the authority in it sent a chill down her spine. "It's Tony. You need to leave right now." "What's going on?" Emilia's heart started to pound. "Where's Lorenzo?" "He's fine for now, but the Russo family, they know about you. They know who you are. Get out of there, now." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt the color drain from her face. She had been warned about the risks of being involved with Lorenzo's world, but the reality of it was hitting too close to home. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream at Tony to explain more, to give her something more concrete than panic. But she didn't have the luxury of time. "Where should I go?" she whispered, her breath shaky. "Get to the back exit and don't look back. We'll take care of the rest." Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Her shift wasn't even over. But the weight of the situation pressed against her chest, and all she could do was move. She rushed through the kitchen, her pulse roaring in her ears, not stopping to speak to anyone as she pushed past the other staff. The back door of Valentino's was hidden from the prying eyes of the street, a small alleyway that led to the hidden parts of the city. She had always known there was danger in Lorenzo's world, but now it was spilling over into hers. She could hear the murmurs from the kitchen staff, the stares from the few patrons still lingering over their last glasses of wine, but she couldn't stop. She stepped into the alley, her breath quick and shallow. Her thoughts were clouded with panic, but as she turned to look around, she saw the black SUV pull up to the curb. It was Lorenzo's men. The familiar faces were more than welcome right now. They were her only escape. The door of the SUV swung open and the driver, one of Lorenzo's most trusted, gestured for her to get in. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the street with military precision. "Get in, we're not safe here." As the car sped through the narrow streets of the city, Emilia's mind raced. She knew she couldn't stay in the city's heart for much longer. The Russo family was too close, too dangerous, and if they knew who she was, if they knew she was involved with Lorenzo, there was no telling how far they would go to make a statement. Her hands were trembling in her lap as the streets blurred past her. It was hard to believe what was happening, what she was being pulled into. She hadn't signed up for this. She hadn't chosen this life. All she wanted was to finish nursing school, to get her brother the care he needed, to build a future away from all of this. But with every passing minute, the choice seemed clearer. Lorenzo had warned her that this world came with danger, with blood, with violence. He had shown her the sharp edge of his life, but now it was cutting into hers. She couldn't deny it any longer. She was tangled in it just as much as he was. Her thoughts kept coming back to him, Lorenzo, the man who had built an empire on fear and intimidation, the man who ruled half of the city's criminal operations with cold precision. But in the quiet moments when they were alone, she had seen something else in him, something softer, something more human. She had seen the cracks in the armor, the vulnerability he fought to hide, the loneliness he carried like a secret. And as much as she hated the life he led, she couldn't ignore the connection they shared. It was real, and it was growing, and it terrified her. Her heart ached as the car turned onto a quieter street, heading toward a safe house that Lorenzo had set up for emergencies like this one. The closer they got to it, the more Emilia felt the weight of the decision she had to make. She could walk away. She could cut herself off from this world, from Lorenzo, and try to protect herself from the consequences of her involvement. But that wasn't who she was. She had never run from a challenge. She had never shied away from the hard fight. And Lorenzo needed her. She couldn't leave him to face it all alone, not when she knew the truth about him, about the man beneath the Mafia boss. She closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. I'm in this now. The car came to a stop and the door opened. She stepped out, her mind made up. Emilia, Tony's voice was low, almost sympathetic. We've got to keep you safe. Stay here and don't contact anyone. Lorenzo will handle it. She nodded, barely hearing him. All she could think of was Lorenzo, and the life she had chosen to be a part of, the one where everything was complicated, dangerous, and now irrevocable. Later that night, Lorenzo finally contacted her. The text came through just as she was sitting in the small, dimly lit room that had been set up as a temporary safe haven. He had told her to stay away, to be cautious, but Emilia had no intention of hiding forever. The danger was real, but it was the unknown that terrified her the most. Emilia, I know you're scared, but I won't let anything happen to you, no matter what. I'll protect you. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her heart ache. There it was again, the vulnerability that she had seen in him that day at the cafe. Lorenzo Moretti, the king of the underworld, offering protection, not just as a mafia boss, but as the man she had come to know. She hadn't expected him to be so protective. She hadn't expected him to care about her in this way. She had always known that love, that affection, was dangerous in his world, but now she realized that his world was becoming her world too, and he wasn't going to let her slip away, not without a fight. That was the moment she knew she couldn't walk away. He was committing to her in his own way, and now it was her turn to commit to him. They were both in this, whether they liked it or not. I'm staying, she texted back, the words simple but resolute. I'll be with you, whatever happens. Lorenzo's response came quickly. Good, you're not alone in this. Not anymore. The next few days were filled with tension and uncertainty. The Russo family had become a looming threat over everything, and Lorenzo's world had been turned upside down. His power, his control was being tested in ways it hadn't been in years. Every decision had to be made with precision, every move calculated to keep him at the top of the game. And yet, in the midst of it all, Emilia could see the change in him. Lorenzo, who had once believed that love was a weakness, was starting to question that notion. She could see it in the way he spoke to her, the way he treated her, like she mattered, like she was more than just a fleeting distraction in his violent world. Lorenzo had started to talk about a future beyond the Mafia, a future where he could leave behind the darkness and build something legitimate. But every conversation was tainted with doubt. Could he truly walk away from everything he had known? Would his empire allow him to? In the quiet moments when they were alone, Emilia could see the internal battle in his eyes. He didn't want to let go of the life he had built, but he didn't want to lose her either. And that was the turning point, the realization that for the first time in his life, there was something worth fighting for, something more than power. But it wouldn't be easy. Breaking free from the life he had created, the family he had inherited, would be a monumental task. He knew it, and Emilia knew it. But whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, more than anything, gave him the courage to continue down a path that was both uncertain and promising. Lorenzo Moretti had built his empire on the foundations of loyalty and fear. His power was absolute, or so he had believed. Every decision, every move, every calculated risk had been part of a plan to create a world where no one could touch him. He ruled with a ruthless hand, taking what he wanted and destroying anything that dared to challenge him. But that night, everything changed. The betrayal came when he least expected it, when he had finally allowed himself to believe that things could be different. His enemies had always been there, lurking in the shadows, but this was something worse. This was someone from within his own circle, someone he had trusted. It started as a normal evening. Lorenzo had just finished a long day of meetings, discussions, and the usual affairs of his empire. His mind was consumed with plans for expanding his legitimate business ventures, as well as navigating the increasingly hostile environment created by the Russo family. Yet, as he walked into his penthouse, a single message shattered the calm facade of his night. Urgent. Get to the warehouse, now. The message was from Tony, one of his most trusted men. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. There was an edge to the message that didn't sit right with him. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of experience, and they told him something was wrong. He had no time to waste. He grabbed his jacket and moved quickly. As he entered the underground parking garage, the familiar hum of his bodyguards' cars felt reassuring. But something felt off. He reached the warehouse in record time, his mind racing with possibilities. What was happening? What could possibly need his immediate attention? When they arrived, the door was already cracked open, and the faint sound of voices drifted through the darkness. Lorenzo's men flanked him as they entered the building, weapons drawn. Everything seemed normal at first, until they rounded the corner. The sight that greeted him was one he would never forget. Tony, his closest ally, lay on the ground, a pool of blood forming beneath him. His eyes were wide with shock and fear. But the most shocking thing was the man standing over him, the man Lorenzo had once trusted implicitly, a longtime ally, now holding a gun in his hand, aimed at Lorenzo's chest. In that split second, the world seemed to slow down. Betrayal hit harder than any bullet ever could. Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat, and his mind screamed in disbelief. Marco. It was Marco, his right-hand man. Marco, the one he had relied on for years, the one who had helped him build his empire, the man who had become like family. And now Marco had turned on him. Lorenzo! Marco's voice was cold, filled with venom. You've had it too easy for too long. It's time for a new order, one where I'm in control. The words didn't sink in at first. Lorenzo's thoughts were clouded with rage and confusion. Marco, his closest ally, the man he had once trusted with his life, was the one who had set this trap. But before Lorenzo could react, the sound of gunfire rang through the warehouse. Emilia was nowhere near the chaos, but her life was about to be irrevocably altered. She had been at her apartment trying to relax after a grueling shift when she received a call from one of Lorenzo's men. Emilia, you need to leave, right now. The panic in the man's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just the usual threat she had become accustomed to when involved with Lorenzo. It was different. The man on the other end was terrified. Where's Lorenzo? She demanded, her heart beginning to race. He's in trouble. It's bad. We can't get to him in time. You need to go somewhere safe. They know about you. Emilia's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation sank in. The Russo family, the very ones who had been trying to take control of Lorenzo's operations, were now after her. She had no time to think, only to move. She grabbed her phone and keys, quickly throwing together whatever she could find, her mind only on the danger that was now closing in on her. But as she turned to leave, her front door crashed open. The rush of footsteps was the only warning she had before 3 men in dark suits stormed in, guns drawn. Emilia barely had time to react. They grabbed her, pulling her from her apartment before she could even scream for help. Lorenzo, his mind still reeling from the shock of the betrayal, had just enough time to duck behind cover when the first gunshot rang out. The explosion of sound was deafening, but his instincts kicked in, his body reacting before his mind could process. He returned fire, but Marco was already disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. By the time Lorenzo had neutralized the immediate threat and checked on his men, his heart was pounding in his chest, not just from the gunfight, but from the fear gnawing at him. Amelia. He had been so focused on the immediate danger that he had forgotten her. The very people who had tried to bring him down were now after her. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out, praying it wasn't too late. He read the message from Tony. "They've taken her. We're coming for you, but you need to stay put." The panic in Lorenzo's chest exploded into action. He wasn't going to wait. Not when it came to Amelia. He needed to find her, fast. The old Lorenzo Moretti would have reacted without hesitation. He would have used his power, his violence to strike back. He would have made an example of Marco and anyone who stood in his way. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside him shifted. The thought of losing Amelia, of her being caught in the crossfire of his violent world, was too much to bear. "I can't let her get hurt, not because of me." He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had something to lose, someone who mattered to him, and that realization had hit him like a ton of bricks. Instead of immediately launching a counterattack on Marco, Lorenzo made a decision that surprised even him. He would fight this in a way he never had before. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling with a newfound sense of urgency. "I need a lawyer," he said, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. "Get me the best damn one you can find." The hours passed in a blur. Amelia had been taken to a safe house, the location changing constantly to evade anyone who might be hunting her. She was locked away in a room with no windows. Only the muffled sounds of footsteps in the hall and the occasional knock at the door. Every so often, someone would come in to check on her, but no one dared to speak to her for long. She tried to remain calm, to think logically, but her thoughts were consumed with Lorenzo. What was happening to him? Was he okay? She had just begun to sink into the hopelessness of her situation when the door creaked open again. It was Tony, his face drawn and pale. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but we're not out of the woods yet. Lorenzo, he's changed." Amelia frowned. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Tony hesitated before sitting down across from her. "Lorenzo's not acting like he used to. He's trying something different. He's going after this betrayal with lawyers, not bullets." Her heart skipped a beat. "What?" "He's trying to distance himself from the violence, Amelia. He's changing. And I think it's because of you." Amelia's chest tightened as she processed his words. The idea that Lorenzo was trying to leave behind the world he had built, to fight in a way that didn't involve death and destruction, it was both shocking and deeply moving. But would it work? Would his change be enough to protect them both? As she looked into Tony's eyes, she knew one thing for certain. The world they were living in was changing, and with it, everything she had come to know about Lorenzo was shifting. The mafia boss she had met weeks ago was starting to fade, and in his place, a new man was emerging. A man who was trying to escape the violence of his past. A man who wanted more than just power. And somehow, Amelia was right there, caught in the middle of it all. The real battle had only just begun. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm, and Amelia could feel it pressing on her chest as she moved through the day. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, fear, uncertainty, and a growing sense of inevitability. The Russo family was closing in, and Lorenzo's world was spiraling toward a final confrontation. His plans to handle things differently, to move beyond violence, were being tested in ways he had never imagined. But there was another battle raging inside her, one that had nothing to do with guns or bloodshed. It was the battle for her heart. Amelia had never intended to get involved with a man like Lorenzo. She had seen the warning signs, the rumors of the Mafia kingpin who controlled half the city's underworld. She had heard about his ruthlessness, the way he ruled through fear, his empire built on betrayal and blood. She had been determined to stay away from the chaos that surrounded him, to keep her focus on her family and her future. But that had all changed the moment she had stood up to him in Valentino's, the moment her defiance had cracked the wall he had spent years building around himself. Now there was no pretending she could walk away. Lorenzo had become a part of her life, in ways that scared her. The man who had once seemed like a distant figure, cold, calculating, unshakable, was now someone she could not ignore. His pain, his vulnerability, his desire for change had become as real to her as her own feelings, and with every passing day, those feelings grew stronger, more undeniable. But the question still loomed over her. Could she accept the danger that came with loving a man like him? It was one of those rare nights when Lorenzo didn't have an agenda or a plan in motion, a night where the world wasn't trying to tear him apart. The air was crisp as they sat together in the private room of a quiet cafe, the soft hum of conversation from other patrons barely reaching them. He looked at her across the table, his eyes filled with a complexity that made her breath catch. They hadn't talked much about the future, not the kind of future that mattered, the kind where she could stay safe, away from the Mafia world he had dragged her into. But tonight, Emilia knew that this conversation was inevitable. The final confrontation with the Russo family was drawing near. She could see the burden on his face, the weight of a decision he hadn't made yet, and she needed to make her own decision too. "Lorenzo," she began, her voice soft but resolute, "I need to know where we stand. I can't keep pretending that I'm not worried about you, about me, about everything. The Russo family is about to make their move, and if things go wrong, what happens to us?" Lorenzo's fingers tightened around his glass, his jaw tensing as he met her gaze. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear but also determination. He had made countless decisions in his life, but none like this, none that involved her. "I've been thinking about that too," he said slowly, his voice low, almost guarded. "I can't promise that everything will be safe. I can't promise you that you won't get hurt, but I can promise you this. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. I'm willing to lose everything, my power, my empire, if it means I can protect you." Her heart ached at his words, and yet, in some twisted way, she felt both comforted and terrified. He had always been a man of power, someone who was untouchable in the eyes of the world, but now he was telling her that he would risk it all for her. "Lorenzo, you can't just walk away from the life you've built. You've spent your entire life creating this empire. How can you just give that up?" His eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice heavy with emotion. "Because it's never been real, Emilia. Not really. I've had everything, but I've had nothing too. You're the first real thing I've had in years, and I can't lose that." Her pulse quickened. "First real thing, sing." The words echoed in her mind, crashing against her walls of doubt. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the realities of his world, but now she was starting to see it. The vulnerability that he had hidden behind his cold, powerful exterior. She wasn't just a passing interest to him, she was someone he needed, someone who had made him question everything he had built. Emilia took a deep breath, her eyes scanning his face, searching for answers. She had to decide. Did she stand by him, knowing the dangers that came with it? Could she continue to walk this tightrope between love and fear? "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can keep loving you, knowing what you do, knowing the price I might have to pay." Lorenzo reached out, his hand finding hers on the table, his grip firm but gentle. "I can't promise you that everything will be easy, Emilia. But I can promise that I'll spend the rest of my life making this right, making us right. I'm not asking you to stay because I want you to be part of my world. I'm asking because I want you in my life, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." Emilia's chest tightened, the words cutting deeper than she had expected. She had always told herself that she wouldn't get involved in something this dangerous. But now, with Lorenzo's sincerity laid bare before her, she knew there was no walking away. Not now, not when she had already let herself fall so deeply in love with him. Her voice was steady as she met his gaze. "I'm in this, Lorenzo. I don't know where this path will lead, but I can't walk away from you, not now." Lorenzo's life had always been one of shadowed power, of making deals in the darkness, of being feared and respected by everyone who crossed his path. But now, standing in front of a crowded gala hall, he realized just how much he had changed. The event was one of the most exclusive in the city. Politicians, businessmen, and their families all gathered to celebrate. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, and the soft clink of champagne glasses filled the air. But amidst the sea of faces, Lorenzo's eyes were fixed on only one person, Emilia. She stood across the room, a vision in a deep red dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves. She looked out of place among the polished elite, but to Lorenzo, she was the most beautiful thing in the room. And it was in that moment, standing on the edge of his old world, that he realized how much he needed to show her, not just with words, but with action. How much she had come to mean to him. The whispers began the moment he moved toward her, every eye in the room following his every step. He wasn't just walking to Emilia, he was walking toward a new beginning. As he reached her side, his hand gently rested on her arm, and without a word, he guided her to the center of the ballroom. The music paused as he stood before her, his expression intense and unwavering. "Lorenzo." Emilia's voice was a mix of confusion and surprise. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces that had watched him for years, the people who had always seen him as a symbol of power. "This woman," Lorenzo's voice rang out loud enough for the room to hear, "is the reason I'm here tonight. She is the reason I'm standing before you as something more than just the wolf. She's the reason I've started to question the life I've led. She's the first person to ever look at me and not see the monster, and I won't hide that any longer." Emilia's eyes widened, shock and disbelief flashing across her face. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to make of his sudden declaration. Lorenzo turned back to Emilia, his gaze softening as he reached for her hand. "I'm done hiding, Emilia, from you, from them, from myself. I love you, and I don't care who knows it." The ballroom erupted into whispers, but for the first time in his life, Lorenzo didn't care. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man, standing in front of the woman he loved, telling the world who he truly was. Emilia stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. There, in front of everyone, Lorenzo had declared his love for her, not as a mafia kingpin, but as a man. And in that moment she realized that no matter the danger, no matter the cost, she was already too far gone to ever walk away. Lorenzo had shown her his vulnerability. Now it was time to show the world that he wasn't just the wolf. He was something more, something real. And so, in front of everyone, Emilia stepped forward, her hand in his, her heart full of both fear and love. She had crossed a boundary just as he had. But now there was no turning back. "I love you too, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion. "And I'm not afraid anymore." The applause that followed was faint against the roar of her own heartbeat. For the first time, they both felt free. The soft hum of the city outside the penthouse windows seemed distant, a muted reminder of the world that existed beyond their own. Inside, everything felt different. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the space between them. Tonight was unlike any other, and neither of them could escape the gravity of what was about to unfold. Lorenzo Moretti had spent his entire life building an empire founded on fear, control, and violence. He had shaped the world around him with cold precision, never once allowing himself to stray from the path he had set for himself. But all of that had changed with Emilia. With her, he had found something worth fighting for, a reason to step beyond the world he had known, to consider a future he had never believed possible. The past few months had been a whirlwind. Their love, born from a single moment of defiance, had blossomed into something deeper, something real. But that reality came with its own set of challenges. Challenges that Lorenzo had always known would come, but that he now faced with a new perspective. He had told her once that he was willing to leave behind everything for her, and now, in the quiet of his penthouse, he was ready to make good on that promise. Emilia stood by the window, her hands resting lightly on the glass, gazing out at the skyline, the soft light from the streetlights below reflected in her eyes, giving them a sparkle he couldn't look away from. He had seen that look many times before, when they had talked about their future, about what could be. But tonight was different. Tonight everything was about to change. Lorenzo stepped forward, his movements measured, almost deliberate. He had never been one for grand gestures. His life had always been about control, about getting what he wanted through influence and fear. But tonight, he was ready to do something different, something for her, for them. Emilia turned when she felt his presence beside her, her heart skipping a beat as their eyes met. There was something different in his gaze tonight, something softer, yet more resolute. She had seen this side of him before, but never quite like this. "Lorenzo?" Her voice was tentative, the question hanging in the air between them. She had felt the tension all day, a quiet anticipation that had built in the pit of her stomach. But now, with him standing so close, she couldn't quite put into words what she was feeling. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and steady, "about everything we've been through, about everything we've faced, and everything we will face." He paused for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. "I know I can't change the past. I can't undo what I've done, the things I've built. But what I can do is build something new, something better, something that's ours." Emilia swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. She had always known Lorenzo's past would follow him, that the shadows of his former life would never fully disappear. But what he was saying now was different. He wasn't talking about leaving it all behind in a moment of reckless abandon. He was talking about building something together, something that could last. Lorenzo took a step closer, his hand gently reaching for hers. "I've spent my life trying to control everything, trying to build an empire that no one could touch. But the truth is, Emilia, the only thing that matters to me now is you. You and the life we could have together." Emilia's heart raced. She had never imagined that the man who stood before her, the man who ruled with an iron fist, could speak so openly about vulnerability, about wanting something more than power, and yet here he was, offering her something she hadn't dared to hope for. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if I can be what you need. I don't know if I can live in this world with you, this world you've built." Lorenzo smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I don't need you to be what I've built. I need you to be what we can build together. We don't have to live in the shadows anymore, Emilia. We can have a life that's ours, free from all the darkness." He stepped back, his hands finding the pocket of his suit jacket. Emilia's breath caught in her throat as he pulled out a small velvet box, his fingers steady despite the rush of emotions that swirled between them. "I'm asking you, Emilia, to walk with me, to choose this life with me, not just because of who I am, but because of who we can become together." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring, an emerald set in a simple band of gold, elegant but striking. The ring seemed to glow in the soft light of the penthouse, symbolizing everything he was offering her. Emilia stared at the ring, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never thought this moment would come, not like this, not with someone like him. And yet as she looked at him, standing there with so much uncertainty in his eyes, she realized that she didn't need a perfect future. What mattered was the choice they made together. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I don't know if we can escape what we've both been a part of, but I do know that I love you, and I'm willing to try." Lorenzo's face softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had spent so many years fighting, scheming, and controlling, but this was different. This was the moment where everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, would finally mean something. It wasn't just power or revenge, it was love. And that was the one thing he had never truly understood until now. Amelia, you are everything to me. You always have been. He slid the ring onto her finger, his gaze never leaving hers. This is more than just a ring. It's a promise to build a life with you, a life that's ours. Amelia felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she looked down at the ring, the weight of it symbolizing more than just a physical object. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome, everything they had yet to face, and everything they would become together. "Of course, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll marry you. I'll build this life with you, whatever comes." The engagement, simple but profound, marked a new beginning for both of them. In that moment, the past, both the good and the bad, seemed to fade into the background. There would still be challenges, still be risks. Lorenzo's empire could never fully escape the shadows of its foundation, and Amelia knew the world they had to navigate would never be without danger. But together, they were something different. They were two people who had chosen to fight for each other, to build a life despite the odds stacked against them. Lorenzo was ready to step into the light with her, to leave behind the life that had defined him for so long. Amelia continued her work in nursing, now with a renewed sense of purpose. The hospital became her sanctuary, a place where she could make a difference, where she could heal and protect those who needed it most. Her career was no longer just a means to an end. It was her calling, her passion. And Lorenzo, though still connected to his world, found himself drawn more and more to legitimate business ventures. Together, they began to build something that was theirs, a life that didn't rely on fear or violence. They invested in real estate, opened a few legitimate businesses, and slowly but surely, Lorenzo started to break free from the chains of his past. It wasn't easy, and the temptation to revert to old ways was always there, but Amelia kept him grounded. The road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more uncertainties, but they had each other. And for the first time in his life, Lorenzo knew what it meant to be truly free. Free from the past, free from the darkness, and free to love the woman who had given him a chance at something better. As they stood together looking toward the future, the world seemed a little less daunting. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough. The story closed with their future stretched out before them, uncertain, yes, but filled with hope. And in that hope, they had found something worth fighting for, something worth building together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey of love, power, and change, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more captivating stories. Leave a comment below. What would you choose, love or power? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, true strength lies in the choices we make. Until next time, stay brave, stay true, and stay inspired.